Scotland Yard was baffled. The FBI was baffled. They sent for me, and the case was solved immediately. I confessed.
Welcome to the Marx Brothers Council podcast. And from the files of FBI and Scotland Yard, we bring you episode 18, Marx Brothers, Unsolved. Your host, Matthew Kanayam. Well, thank you, that masked man. And yes, welcome all to the Marx Brothers Council podcast. And this episode of the podcast is being guest produced by Owen Allen, which means that Bob, Noah and myself will all be recording our respective contributions separately. It will then be Bob's task as an editor to stitch these separate recordings together so as to make it sound as though we're having an actual conversation. Let's see how good he is at it as I pretend to introduce my co-hosts. First, the man who may have done more than anyone living to remind us that the Marx Brothers were funny before the Coconuts by reviving and restaging their lost Broadway debut, I'll Say She Is, a story told with wit, aplomb, and compound adjectives in his book Gimme a Thrill. He's also a noted expert on the history of New York and author of the books 400 Years in Manhattan, Love Marches On, and Anna Karenina, which he wrote entirely in Russian for a bet. If I were to say his name is Noah Diamond, that's hopefully all the information you'll need. It's Noah Diamond.
Mr. Allen, should I introduce myself now and you'll put it in? I am Noah. Hello.
Hello. Next, a man of whom I hath already spake, Bob Gazelle. His name sounds a bit like gazelle, but don't let that fool you. He's not a gazelle, he's a man. He's also a research bloodhound and an expert video and sound editor, a passion he first nurtured as a boy when he discovered J. Edgar Hoover in his bathroom taping The Couple Next Door. Please welcome a separately made recording of Bob Gazelle.
Hi, everyone. And to set the scene, I'm sitting in my basement with a jar of raisins and a couple of cats. So let's do this. Come on.
And joining us on this edition, making a welcome return visit to our shores after a long and weary trek back from episode 6, is the man who is to Marxian research what Marxian research is to him, Stewart Tryster.
Very well put, actually. And this is my second visit here. I've now got the hang of it. This time, you couldn't fool me, I'm wearing clothes. And the reason I know I'm wearing clothes is because my wife said to me at lunch, "You're not going to wear that shirt on the podcast." So I am actually, but...
Well, we said at the head of the show that this episode was titled Marx Brothers Unsolved. So now that we've arrived at its shoulders, I suppose a word or two of explanation is in order. In our room service show last time, I mentioned that the curious enigma that is the variant version of the film in which a different song had been written, recorded and dubbed over Swing Low, Sweet Chariot was probably, for me, the most intriguing of all Marx Brothers mysteries. Well, emboldened by the lively response we received, I thought it might be fun to chew over some others, because while the rogue room service song mystery may be my favourite, it's far from the only one. So in this edition, we'll be using the Sherlock Holmes method to nominate our other most persistent and perplexing Marxian head-scratchers, and doing our best to come up with a shoddy, incoherent explanation for them. So let's start then by going back to room service, because we did get some feedback on that. And in fact, also, we had an interesting suggestion live on the show from Noah, which I kind of was quite interested in, which was, is it possible that some other use of the song at that time might have had a bearing on it? This prompted me on a research mission, which turned out to be a wild goose chase, but it might be worth just mentioning because it is quite nice. Some of these things that research throws up that never gets into books and things because it turns out to be wrong, but it's still fun. When you put room service swing low into a search engine, you bring up constant references to a 1937 Paramount film called Swing High, Swing Low, which many of you listening may have seen, because I think it's public domain now. It's a film with Fred McMurray and Carole Lombard. And what really intrigued me was that it was banned in Panama. And I thought, okay, this film was banned in Panama. That might make them feel a bit skittish. But when I looked into it, it was banned in Panama simply because it was partially set in Panama. And I think it was actually banned sight unseen on the fairly sound assumption that
they couldn't edit out all the Panama references?
All the references to Panama, yeah. On the fairly sound assumption that a Hollywood version of Panama was bound to be offensive in some way. I think they just kind of banned it outright. Anyway, there was a happy ending.
I didn't know that about the banning.
Yeah.
I would have behaved differently. No, I once, many years ago, I was introduced to the Panamanian ambassador to Israel, and I sang him an entire chorus of Panamania. I'm not realizing the film had been banned there at one point.
Well, the ban was rescinded after an appeal, so there was a happy ending. But obviously, it was a cul-de-sac as far as room service was concerned. But then there was some interesting stuff has come up on our Twitter thread, I believe.
That's right. A Twitter user named Scott A. Sandage, or perhaps Sandage, Sandage. Let me know if I've got that wrong.
That's a
Scott,
wacky Twitter name.
Yeah, it's one of those crazy handles. Yeah, he advanced an interesting theory after our last episode, suggesting that perhaps Swing Low, Sweet Chariot was closely associated with the great performer Paul Robeson, who had incurred the animus of the British government at the time because of his support of the Welsh miners during that crisis, and also perhaps because of his closeness with emerging Russian communism. I thought, well, that might be interesting, but as with all other explanations for this doppelganger song, even if Robeson was in disfavor at the time and the song was too closely associated with him to be considered without him, it still seems like so much trouble to go to make this entirely alternate 19th century spiritual. But I thought Mr. Sandage made some interesting points. However, even more interesting ones were subsequently made by Matthew and Rodney Stewart. I can't not call you Rodney because of it's because of Groucho on the Jack Benny show. It was Rodney in rehearsal. Anyhow, we have since established that Paul Robeson, even if he did get a slap on the wrist from some British authorities over those notions, he also appeared in numerous British films during this period and was plainly loved by Britain.
Unfortunately, yes, it's like all these explanations. It's absolutely brilliant. The only thing wrong with it is stubborn facts getting in the way. But yes, he was actually very much he loved England and England loved him. He kind of came here as a kind of an escape from the pressures of living in America, and was absolutely taken to the British heart. That he made 5 movies between 1936 and 1940 here, all of which were reissued during that period. And he became a kind of a heroic figure here. There's a very interesting chapter in a very good book called Films and British National Identity by Geoffrey Richards, which has got a chapter in it called The Black Man as Hero, which is largely given over to Robeson's work in Britain, and it makes a very interesting point. It says although he generally felt much more unmolested in Britain, and I'm quoting here, there was a celebrated incident in which he and his wife were refused entry into the Savoy Grill on account of their colour. This was taken up both in the press and in Parliament. Interestingly, it was ascribed to the influence of American race prejudice on Britain rather than seen as a byproduct of empire. So I'm afraid I don't think a possible Robeson connection could be the answer.
No, he was loved at that time, I think. Before coming to the podcast, I took a look again at that clip of the two together, and the quality of the two versions is so similar. I mean, one may have been done after the other, but if you told me that an alternative had been needed and had known to be needed from the very beginning, I would have believed it, because they are so similar in quality. And the thing, I was concentrating so much on this, trying to figure out what other angle there could be to it, that suddenly, totally unbidden, Two Ronnies parody of it came back into my head, which concludes, Her name was Harriet, a stripper at the Hippodrome. Swing low, sweet Harriet, took 4 men to carry her home. Yeah, so that's what it did for me.
Yeah, I think the only thing that stands against it being planned from the start is the fact that they're using the same film. I think it might have been easier, as they're obviously miming to the playback anyway. I would have thought they would have just shot that ending twice, because some of the matchup of mouth movements to lyric, it's pretty good, but it's not good enough, I don't think, if that was their idea right from the start. And also, I mean, the fact that the song is so painstakingly a pastiche wouldn't have been necessary if they'd been forewarned. But I'm none the wiser.
None of the explanations we've encountered allow for the complication of coming up with this alternate version. If it was just a matter of cutting out a line or a minor tweak like that, then we could say, well, maybe there was one executive at RKO who had some problem with either the Paul Robeson connection, or there was another film using the song, or any of these things we've discussed. But none of those things seem to justify the effort and expense that was plainly gone to.
You think you've got to look at, you've seen this only in the British print. You haven't checked worldwide to see what was used in every country. You know it was Sweet Chariot for the States, you know it was the Cheerio for England, but you may, if we found out what had been used in every country and where else perhaps the Cheerio version had gone on the strength of archive prints in different countries.
Mikhail Yulin seems pretty sure that they had Cheerio in Sweden.
I did come across some other contemporary review of the film, European, I forgot where, and it mentions Sweet Cheerio.
Wouldn't it be interesting if we discover that there are even further versions of it? They
yes.
made versions of this song for every country, just to keep our podcast going.
Yeah, and just to clarify for everyone, what we're hearing here in this British version is another song, and Groucho's voice is pretty obvious, and I believe we're pretty sure we hear Chico's voice as well.
Yeah.
What makes this especially interesting is that this couldn't be some emergency track done later on. For whatever reason it needed to be done, it had to have been discovered and recorded while they were still shooting the film, because as soon as they were done, the brothers left RKO for good and headed back to MGM.
Have you already checked with Andrea to see whether Zeppo's voice is in there?
Well, so that's where the room service mystery leaves us, I'm afraid. No more wiser than we were in the last edition. But now let's turn the clock back to the start of their careers. In fact, even further than their first film. I've specifically asked Noah if he can dig up any head scratchers from the pre-film period.
And dug them up I have. Just by scratching my head. It's amazing what I can dig up.
You should wash your hair more often.
The early years are, of course, filled with mysteries, and a lot of what happened to the Marx Brothers during the first chapters of their lives and careers. This is the most mystery-shrouded part of their experience for obvious reasons. However, a lot of the mysteries either are so unsolved that there's little to say about them, or they have been addressed by Robert Bader. The landscape of the early years has changed so much with the release of Mr. Bader's excellent Four of the Three Musketeers. So there are a lot of subjects that, we would have kicked them around as enduring mysteries before. And now, even if Bader hasn't completely cracked them, he has explored them absolutely as far as they seem to be explorable. One thing that I think comes up a lot in conversation among fans, and that does endure as an unsolved mystery, is the identity and location of the cigar store in whose window Harpo developed his gookie. As the fans tend to be aware, Harpo developed his famous gookie face, puffed out cheeks, tongue corking the mouth, crossed eyes, by watching a cigar roller in a window somewhere in Upper Manhattan. And as this man rolled cigars with great intensity, he would make this face, unintentionally. And that became a Harpo staple, and it appears at least once in every Marx Brothers movie. But where was this cigar store exactly? there have been numerous attempts to figure that out. In 2002, there's an article in the New York Daily News written by Fergus Gwynplaine McIntyre, who was a Groucho Marx character. He's actually an eccentric, and I think we would have to conclude unwell science fiction writer who committed suicide in 2010 under some fairly grisly circumstances. In this article in the Daily News, which is referenced by Bader in his book, McIntyre claims that he has discovered the identity of Gookie, that Gookie's name is Amedeo Gucci, Gucci, like the Italian designer, and that he had confirmed this information in an interview years previously with Irving Caesar, the songwriter of No No Nanette and other things, who did grow up in Yorkville and knew the Marx Brothers. Caesar was a little bit younger than Gummo, a little bit older than Zeppo. And he did know the Marx Brothers when they were all children. And so McIntyre claims that Caesar confirmed Amedeo Gucci as the identity. However, Bader tirelessly dug into all of this and couldn't find a trace of this Mr. Gucci in business directories or anything else for the period. So he rules that out as a hoax rather convincingly, but comes up with a couple of other possible leads, none of which is satisfying enough to be the answer, but each of which is a possibility. Bader finds that a William Gurka, or Gurky, owned a liquor store at which cigars may well have been rolled. Some versions of the Gookie story call him Gurka, Gehrke. The problem with this one, besides the detail of it being technically a liquor store, is that William Gurka's shop was on Lexington and 120th Street, so it's almost a mile and a half uptown from where the Marx Brothers actually spent most of their early days on 93rd Street. Bader also finds that there's a cigar maker named Ferdinand W. Gollinge, or Galinga, perhaps, Gollinge, who was rolling cigars on 2nd Avenue and 92nd Street, much closer to the neighborhood. And he also uncovers a George Guckert making cigars on 14th Street and 6th Avenue. So if we accept that all of these anecdotes get embroidered and adjusted in the retelling, it's possible that one of those three shops could be the source of this story. But basically, it remains a mystery.
If only we were a bit luckier, if there had been a second or maybe even third child who had imitated him and had originated a Gookie face in different areas, we could triangulate the position, looking at where Harpo lived and where these other kids lived.
Yeah, I mean, it shouldn't be difficult, really, to determine whether a business existed in Manhattan. So the fact that there is no obvious answer to this, that by itself almost establishes that the story got some kind of adjustment as it was told over the years.
But one thing is pretty obvious, that it probably was something at least similar somehow to Gookie, that unlike other things where Harpo, for example, just like changed a name to protect the innocent or the guilty, that here, this name sticking from so early on probably lends credence to the idea that it was something which had some kind of phonetic similarity.
I think that definitely makes sense. But in considering this just in the last week, preparing for this podcast, it occurred to me, the sound of the word Gookie, onomatopoetically, it does. Maybe this is just because I connect it with that face, but that name sounds like that face looks. And yes. I thought, well, it is possible that Harpo, he developed that face perhaps by observing a cigar roller. He decided Gookie was a good thing to call it, and then retrofitted the anecdote.
Incidentally, are we all?
I'm not advancing that as my theory, but it's possible.
Are we all in the habit of seeing it and hearing it as Gookie? Because I've always read it in my mind as Gookie. With the double O stressed hard. I don't know if there's any. Is it just a matter of taste, or is there some rules to follow there?
Well, Bill Marx in interviews consistently says Gookie. I think I'm taking my cue from him.
You got it from the source,
right? Yeah, Gookie it is. Okay, from now on. So it rhymes with cookie. not.
Rhymes with cookie.
Right.
That's right.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, it's obviously a story that's true. I mean, I often run into flack for trying to say, these stories are kind of dead in the water. Too many threads cross here too early, and too few people are needing to be impressed at the time when it starts for it to be anything other than a story with an obvious basis. In fact, so. Yeah, I think that, the search is on, and we need to find out where this chap was.
Well, and similarly, this came up on the Facebook group the other day about the origin of Groucho's walk, which is somewhat hard to pin down. There's certainly inspirations and precedents, but not a specific story that you could tell and say, here's where it came from.
Yeah, I have one other early days thing, which I think I mentioned to you all. Came up a few weeks ago. We talked, I think it was in the wake of the humorist discussions about, how early could there be footage of the Marx Brothers? If that's as the state of affairs is, as long as nothing more of humorist has turned up, the earliest we have really is Harpo in the mid-20s, and another Lost Zeppo vehicle also, where he at least makes a guest appearance. And I think at the time, a little while ago, I made the suggestion, who knows? These guys were big vaudeville stars. They were traveling around with their own train in 1912. They were getting big attention paid to their comings and goings very often. And I was wondering if, like, a newsreel camera might ever have captured them in the teens, for example. Because you got other people like Jolson didn't make a real movie until the 20s, but there's tons of newsreel footage of him in the teens because he was such a big star. Obviously, the Marx Brothers were not that big yet, but something popped up a few weeks ago, I think it was, on a Fred Astaire Facebook group. And I'll read you the little clipping, because I just find what it suggests, the possibility that might open up is very interesting. It's not dated by year, at least it wasn't, but it's got to be, by the look of it, either 1942 or 1943. The headline was, Fred Astaire's first movie was a trailer. Hollywood, March 27th, Associated Press. The Sky's the Limit Company, that's the film that he was making at that point in the 40s, had a screening this week of Fred Astaire's first motion picture. No, it wasn't Flying Down to Rio, which most people think was his first. This one was made in 1916. It is a trailer used on the Orpheum circuit and run in theaters a week ahead of the appearance of Fred and Adele Astaire. Headliner of the trailer is Joe Niemeyer, who owns the reel. Niemeyer, once a star in vaudeville and musical comedy, is now Astaire's stand-in. So I just found that very interesting. This is the first time I came across anything like this, and I wondered how frequently was something like this done. If it was done more frequently than not, somehow, was there a company that specialized in it? Who were their clients? Were the Marx Brothers ever? I'm not saying this if anything exists necessarily, but it's interesting to ask whether people who were had a troupe that was doing as well as the Marx Brothers were and was popular as they were in the teens ever had this kind of thing made as advanced publicity for a live appearance.
Have we come across any other similar trailers?
I haven't yet.
Yeah.
So, and unlike humorist, there's no reason at all why they would ever have mentioned that again. They probably wouldn't have even remembered doing that. So it's a live possibility, isn't it?
Yeah.
No more notable for them than just going into a photographer's studio and having some publicity snaps taken.
Yeah, it's a compelling possibility, and I was completely unaware of the existence of vaudeville trailers until you shared that piece with me.
Well, it was new to me as well, yeah.
Another mystery that has always nagged at me, which is part of the larger mystery of what was it like to see these guys in vaudeville, particularly during the early vaudeville years before their act began to resemble the act that we know from the film years. One of the big differences, if we had somehow the pleasure of sitting through Fun in High School or the Nightingale's act, one of the things that would have been immediately different to us is Groucho's character, which was generally Dutch, which is to say German, Dutch comics being called Dutch because after Deutsch, the German word for German. In following the model of Uncle Al Sheehan, Groucho spent the first stretch of his vaudeville career doing this comic German character during the Nightingales period when supposedly the act was only a musical act. He was doing comedy as a butcher boy character named Hans Pumpernickel. And in some very familiar pictures from the Nightingales period, almost anyone who's ever looked at a Marx Brothers book knows some of those early pictures. Groucho is often said to look like Harpo in them because he has a vaguely Harpo-like wig and a sort of maniacal look on his face. Well, that's Groucho as Hans Pumpernickel, the German butcher boy. And then when the school act began with Fun in High School, Groucho played the same kind of character, but as an old man school teacher, known variously as Mr. Green or Mr. Schneider or other things. So what was that like? What was it like to see Groucho playing this ethnic caricature, so different from the first generation American that we are used to seeing him play?
So in that photograph, that famous photograph of the four of them where Groucho is habitually mistaken for Harpo, that's what he is there, is it? He's right.
Yeah, that's Hans Pumpernickel. And there are ads in Variety in which the character name is referenced, See the Nightingales or the Six Mascots featuring Julius Marx as Hans Pumpernickel. So the character was interesting and known enough to be considered a selling point. And we know that a signature song of Groucho's, perhaps even earlier than this time, but definitely by the Nightingales period, was the German folk song Schnitzelbank, which Groucho delighted in performing all his life. And so there are performances of it. There's a 1955 television version on the Swift Show Wagon, which you can find in the excellent Marx Brothers on TV collection from Shout Factory.
Ist das nicht ein Wagenrad? Ist das nicht ein Krummengrad? Krummengrad, ne Wagenrad, ne hinten her, ne große Schäne, kurz und lang, ne Schnitzelbank. Ei, du schönes, oh, du schönes, oh, du schönes Schnitzelbank.
Schnitzelbank is sort of a classic, and Groucho's delight in performing it is obvious. There's another famous picture of the act from vaudeville when they were the Six Mascots. We'll put this picture on the blog. It's a 1910 photograph showing Groucho, Harpo, Gummo, Lou Levy, Minnie, and Aunt Hannah. And Groucho is in his Hans Pumpernickel character, and he is pointing with a stick to an easel which has a Schnitzelbank chart on it. So that is the song he's singing in that picture, which we know from Joe Adamson's book and many others. So whenever Groucho lapses into a German accent on that Swift Show Wagon appearance, or occasionally on You Bet Your Life, or when he sang Everybody Works But Father on some occasions in a German accent. To me, it always is a kind of just opening the door a little bit and letting a little bit of light in regarding what he was like in that elderly German character.
And he did also speak German, didn't he? A lot of people were surprised, particularly in later life, to find that he was a fairly fluent German speaker, not just vaudeville German.
Yes.
He actually did have the language down. But isn't it interesting that all three of them started off as kind of ethnic characterizations, and only Chico retained it?
Absolutely. In fact, you could say all four of them, because Gummo was playing a character often described as a Hebrew during the early days. And there is something, I think it's both the family ethnic connection to Germany, the Plattdeutsch dialect that Groucho picked up from Minnie and Frenchie, and also the fact that it was so, the song was so ever present in their early years that, if you want to see the real man, Groucho Marx, just being delightfully happy, which is a somewhat rare occasion, just look at any of these clips of him singing Schnitzelbank. He's beaming.
Yes.
He's just, you never see Groucho.
That rare smile appears, doesn't it?
Yeah, this big, broad grin. Our friend Robert Moulton has also pointed out that in Ben Hecht's autobiography, Child of the Century, Hecht tells an anecdote about being at a party where Groucho took over the piano at one point and just launched merrily, in Hecht's word, into Schnitzelbank, and his brothers joined in, and it was obviously something they loved.
And I can just add from my new store of Abbott and Costello, anecdotage. Interesting enough, Lou Costello, after his first failed attempt to crack Hollywood when he appeared in Battle of the Century and not much else, when he then went back and went into burlesque, he started out as a Dutch comic, which is unimaginable, but he did.
No kidding. That's really interesting.
And he obviously failed because the Dutch don't know the first thing about baseball.
Well, I mean, it was such a gigantic paradigm of vaudeville and show business at that time. And I think that's part of why it's lived on. You know, this Schnitzelbank song has more recent pop culture permutations than anything like it normally would. Some people may know it from Animaniacs. It pops up in some of the original Looney Tunes cartoons as well, because it did have this following in vaudeville.
Okay, let's skip to the movies then. Coconut's not many big mysteries to plunder, except for, as Bob pointed out this week, the fact that, as we all know, the original preview version was, depending on what account you read, anything from 20 to 45 minutes longer than the one we have. And unlike Animal Crackers, which is essentially missing most of the play's final act, it's very, very hard looking at the play script to work out what that material might have consisted of. Do we have any thoughts on that?
Well, one thing I can think of, I mean, we've got these moments, I know there aren't that many of them. We've got these things where stills still exist, but the action is gone. Like at the auction scene, after the auction, when Harpo produces the necklace and all that, there's that still of him holding the snake, where he in the play script, you can read he wants to kiss the snake rather than kiss Margaret Dumont, I think. That moment is missing from the film. So we don't know how whether it was large sequences or lots of little things of that nature.
If it could be lots of little snips. I mean, obviously there are songs missing, but I would have thought that there would have been at least some suggestion that they had been shot, if they had been. My understanding was that, for instance, Little Bungalow and so on were cut from the script rather than the movie. But I suppose that's a possibility.
Well, the stage version opens up with a scene establishing some of the secondary characters. That looks like that might have been cut from the film in editing, because what we see in the movie is a musical number followed by what looks like to be a bit of an awkward cut to Groucho on a staircase. It doesn't seem like that was the intended start of that scene. Regardless, it looks like they filmed the entire show from beginning to end and did all the cutting and choosing in post-production. And that's different than what they did in Animal Crackers, where they made all those cutting decisions before they started filming.
Well, we don't really have stills that we can that represent whole long sequences. I mean, there are other things in later movies, like Groucho's courtroom scene at the beginning of At the Circus. We know the stills. We know things that are missing from the original climax of Horse Feathers and stuff like that. We don't have lots of stills where we can say, this is missing from Coconuts, do we?
So what's the deal with the origin of the Wyatt Duck scene? From what I read, it isn't in the original show, or wasn't in the show originally. Did they add it for the movie?
I think it was developed in rehearsal for the show.
Yes.
I think that accounts for quite a few of those kinds of things. It's a bit like Groucho's mistake with Chandler in Animal Crackers, where yes, we know it was scripted, but was it originally scripted, or did it emerge and was kept and developed maybe during performance?
Yeah.
Wyatt Duck is set up in the original play script. I mean, you really expect it, especially if you know the film. There's references to a map of the Coconut Manor area, and you can absolutely see the Marx Brothers rehearsing this show on their feet and saying, wait a minute, let's do something here. This is an obvious invitation to make fun of a map. And I think it is one of those examples of how so often the answer to the question of how much did they ad lib is hard to reach, because so much rehearsed material originated as ad libs. And apparently the whole Wyatt Duck scene was like that. But as it was being ad libbed and developed in rehearsal and or performance, George Kaufman might well have contributed to the writing of it on its feet. So it's hard to identify the origin of every line.
I mean, I don't know what the situation is in America. You probably will, Noah, but certainly over here, because theatre was quite strictly censored here until the late 1960s. If you made any changes to the text of a play, you had to resubmit it to the Lord Chamberlain. And this is a huge problem that Spike Milligan encountered in the 1960s, because his plays were the Bed Sitting Room and Son of Oblomov were basically improvised or largely improvised shows. And so there was a lot of trouble with that, because every time you made a change, you were meant to get that okayed. So that would explain why, you know, an actual play script might be updated rather than it just existing in the minds of the performers. But I presume America didn't really have that problem. But I suppose they would still want to keep... I mean, I'm thinking particularly of the fact that the Animal Crackers script that we have in Kaufman and Co., you know, is obviously a more updated version than, you know, for instance, what's he called? Rabbi Cantor isn't featured, for instance. He's the fish peddler by then, and things like that.
Right.
It's interesting that they kept a written record of the changes.
Can you imagine if Groucho and Harpo had to appear in some government office, and Harpo would say, like, in the middle of scene 5, I'm going to chase a chorus girl across the stage. And then Groucho would have to say, and I'm going to say, well, the 7:45's right on time.
Let me bring up one other thing about coconuts. I want to talk about the print quality of what exists nowadays, especially on the remaster. Much of it is pristine, but there are a few reels that are murky and very soft. And from what I can gather, it's been that way since the first TV package was put together in the 50s. I've looked into this somewhat, and surprisingly, for a while in the 40s, it was considered a lost film. It was missing, or they didn't have a complete print. I wish I had more details, but it's obvious that when the Paramount films were sold to TV and print needed to be found, they cobbled together something from a bunch of different prints. A lot of it is good, but some of it is very murky, as you could see.
Those reels that are bad, are they partially decomposed, or are they like 16mm dupes?
I think they're further generations down.
Yeah.
And I assume that the really good quality ones probably were individual, possibly nitrate reels that had survived where the whole print itself hadn't.
Mm-hmm.
That's my guess from looking at it.
But like Animal Crackers, you would have thought that there would be some print somewhere in the world that would have survived.
Which may still happen, of course.
Yeah.
I mean, this film was shown an enormous amount. It was very early talkie comedy musical, and something could easily turn up, you know. Before we leave coconuts, I don't know if we're about to, but before we do, one thing also, it's not a mystery. It's just a little thing that I hadn't realized until a while ago, and I don't think that many people realize it. Oscar Levant, Harpo's later house guest, his brother was married to Mary Eaton's sister.
Okay.
Wait, I have one other question here about coconuts. How often do you have a big Broadway musical show where it's being translated to the screen where they decide, we're basically going to redo all the music. We're going to write all new songs?
I know there was a lot of uncertainty about musicals per se around that time.
Mm-hmm.
Look at Anything Goes.
A lot of, if you look at the trades, a lot of them say, you know, the musical boom having exploded, you know, Paramount are now doing this, doing that. There was a feeling that musicals weren't going to be a going concern, and a lot of musicals were filmed as you know, without songs in them, or certainly cut down.
Like Animal Crackers.
But yeah, rewriting them.
Yeah.
Animal Crackers again though has that new one in it, doesn't it? Which seems to go against that logic. But you certainly do see that a lot in the trades. It
is pretty rare for a musical to make it to film with its entire score intact, right. And usually it's severely cut. I always thought in the case of Coconuts, maybe it was Irving Berlin taking one more crack at trying to get a hit in this show. Unfortunately, that attempt was The Skies Will All Be Blue When My Dreams Come True, which, whatever we may think of it, is certainly not in the upper echelon of his work at the time. But that could be it. It has become a common practice to add an original song to a musical when adapted for film so as to qualify for a Best Original Song Oscar. But I'm not sure if that goes back as far as 1929.
But you've got these cases a little later in the 30s, 1933, 1934, things like Anything Goes and The Gay Divorcee, where almost the entire score of a successful stage show was substituted with totally new songs.
Yeah, it's frustrating especially for musical theater enthusiasts, because these Hollywood adaptations would be so much more valuable as historic documents if they were more faithful to the stage works they're based on.
Yes, and you do still get them with no songs as well. I mean, that's that this habit of paying presumably a good chunk of money to get the rights to a Broadway show, and then cutting out the songs.
I was surprised to learn that Room Service was a musical. Yeah.
But I mean, right up to Irma la Douce. Irma la Douce was a musical, but with no songs in the film. It is a strange recurring Hollywood custom.
What happened to all the songs in Pygmalion?
It's a Woody Allen line, isn't there? One of his stand-up routines. He said he's been hired to take the My Fair Lady and remove all the songs and turn it back into Pygmalion.
Yes. Yeah.
Anyway, let's move on to Animal Crackers then, and I'd like to just kick off Animal Crackers with a solved mystery, just for punctuation. And it's an interesting one, because not everybody knows it's solved, and not everybody knows it's a mystery in the first place, and that is the identity of Abe Kabibble, the alter ego, supposedly, or we've been led to believe, of Roscoe W. Chandler. As many people know, Chandler, certainly in an early incarnation of the play, was revealed to be Rabbi Cantor, which was a dig at Otto Kahn. But certainly by the time the play script that is published in Kaufman and Co. was written, he's now revealed to be a fish peddler. And in the film, there's a confusing scene where Chico says to him,
"Someplace I met you before, because your faces are very familiar."
Well, after all, I'm one of the most well-known men in America. The newspapers will keep on running my photograph.
You're not Abe Kabibble.
Oh, nonsense, you.
And because he then, at the end of this sequence, identifies him as Abe the Fishman, the view that he is in fact called Abe Kabibble has taken root, and you'll find it in Glenn Mitchell and Simon Luvish and Alan Aylis and Stephen Kampfer and various other places. But of course, it can't be true if you look at the scene, because Chico says, "You're not Abe Kabibble," and Chandler says, "Oh, nonsense," and just wafts it away. The scene then cuts to another shot with Chico saying, "If you're not Abe Kabibble, who are you? Someplace I met you before," and so on and so on and so on. And then eventually,
He come from Czechoslovakia, and I know who it is. That's Abe the fish peddler from Czechoslovakia.
Ridiculous, I tell you.
now obviously if this was Abe Kabibble, it would make no sense at all, because he came up with his name right at the start. He wouldn't need to go through all that. What's actually happening is there's a joke there that we've forgotten about. Abe Kabibble was a huge cultural figure. He was a comic Jewish agent, Abe the Agent, a strip cartoon, a comic strip created by Harry Hirschfield, and a car salesman as well. And he looked a bit like Chandler. He's got a vaguely Louis Sorin like way with him. But he became a huge cultural figure who went on to there are songs. There's a song written by Joe Swirling, in fact, of humorous fame, and comic sketches.
Abe dictates a letter. Mr. Mendel Mintz, dear sir, enclosed find my check for $1,000 what I owe you. I am sorry to have kept you waiting. Yours truly, Abe Kabibble. This is the kind of a letter I would have written you if I had the money.
That's who Abe Kabibble is, and it's just a joke. And as I wrote in the annotated Marx Brothers, the only thing that makes it confusing is the fact that the fish peddler does turn out to be called AB. And I think I say there something like, if only they'd called him something else, the fish peddler, this never would have happened. But of course, I was underestimating Chico, who, whether through forgetfulness or just sheer bloody mindedness, I think did that himself, because in Kaufman and Co., he is called Ivan the fish peddler. So I think we have Chico to thank for these decades of confusion.
I might add, and in fact definitely will add, that on October 1st, 1924, it was Cartoonists' Night at Alsatia's at the Casino Theater on Broadway. And Harry Hirschfield, who Matthew names as the creator of A.B. the Agent, was one of the cartoonists who was in attendance as an honored guest of cartoonist Will B. Johnstone, who wrote the book and lyrics for the show. And in order to celebrate all of these honored guests, who included not just Hirschfield, but Rube Goldberg and Winsor McKay, Frederick Burr Opper, lots of noted cartoonists of the time, the Marx Brothers added a scene to Alsatia's that night in which the four of them stood on stage at easels and, according to the press account anyway, faithfully recreated some of the famous cartoons created by the guys in the audience, including the Katzenjammer Kids, Happy Hooligan, and A.B. the Agent. So if we are to believe this somewhat fanciful-sounding press account, one of the four Marx Brothers stood there on stage at the casino that night and drew a picture of Abe Kabibble.
But which one?
It does not specify, but if I had to guess, I would say it was not Zeppo.
Okay, let's move on to just a very quick and minor Animal Crackers puzzle, which I think Bob might want to contribute to, which is the curious affair of the scratched out flit can. The can that Harpo uses to neutralize his potential victims. The brand name Flit is laboriously and very crudely scratched out in one scene, but not in another. Why on earth?
Yeah, well, Flit, of course, not of course, but for those who don't know, is a incesticide.
That's a Nirvana album.
Insecticide. And while I'm sure the company didn't mind the incidental reference to their product earlier in the film, it's a whole nother kettle of fish seeing it being used to incapacitate people in the finale. You can understand them wanting to distance themselves from that. So perhaps after the film first came out, they went back and scratched it out.
We have no idea how early this happened, do we? Like, at what point? Because it was obviously shot without it being scratched out.
Yeah, but now that we have the restored version, the uncut version, it's done even then. So it's
very early, we can say, yeah.
It's interesting that it's in the dialogue. I mean, Chico specifically says, "No, that's a Flitz" during the fish.
Yes.
Fight. Yeah. So it is identified by the brand name in the dialogue.
I think Bob's explanation is the only one, or certainly the only one I can think of that makes sense, provided it's being done competently. The only other possible explanation is incompetence, which is to say somebody was instructed to scratch it out, and so they did it not realizing it was also in another scene, and it just got by the way things sometimes do. But that other than that, the only explanation I can think of that makes sense is Bob's one, which is very, very noble of them to not want people being killed with flit cans.
And everybody finds it so adorable that Harpo is putting everyone to sleep at the end of the film. But no, he's killing them.
He's spraying insecticide in their faces.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, it wasn't satisfying shooting statues with a gun, so he had to do something.
Okay, well, the big mystery with Animal Crackers is the doubles, the use of stand-in Marxes in the sequence that is set in darkness when the storm puts out the lights. I believe I'm correct in saying that the annotated was the first book to raise this and attempt to explain it. But obviously, it had a long life before that on the internet. I do stubbornly, however, cling to my belief that I was the first person to spot it. We have to go back to the early 1980s. I'm in my bedroom watching it on a Betamax video on a small portable television with my friend Richard, and I just said, "Hey, look, he doesn't look like Groucho there." And an unspoken understanding passed between us, and the pause button was pressed, and that's when I first realized that there was something very strange going on. I then wrote to Ray White, who many of you will know. You'll recognize that name. He was the British point of contact for Fredonia Gazette. He was the person you joined got your magazines from if you lived in Britain. So I wrote to him and told him about it. And he wrote back with his characteristic, almost illegible, faint grey typing. I thought that was just something that he reserved for me, but other British people have since said, "Yeah, what was the deal with those letters you joined? You got this fabulous red letterhead with the Marxes face down the side, and this typing from Ray that you can virtually not read." I can only assume it was because the fact that Ray was, and indeed still is, an eye specialist, that he was giving us a free eye test at the same time. Anyway, I wrote to Ray White, and he phoned me. We had a long chat on the phone, and we talked about several things, including that. And his position at that point was, yes, interesting, but I'm not sure. So I then wrote it up as a little short article in which I just outlined the problem, didn't make any effort to try and explain it, and sent that via Ray to the Fredonia Gazette, not realizing that, unfortunately, the issue that I had already received and read would prove to have been the last one. So nothing more came of that, and then the internet happened, and once I came late to the internet, I found that it had been spotted.
It's probably something that wouldn't have been even noticed until the advent of home video, where somebody could go back and look at it again.
Exactly, yes.
Somebody might have noticed it in the theater when they saw it, but by the time the film ended, they probably forgot about it and moved on.
Yes. Most people on the internet, I discovered, seemed to think it was that the Groucho in the scene was being played by Zeppo. And this identification, to me, seemed to hinge on a number of errors. Firstly, and most importantly, there was the precedent, the famous story of Zeppo standing in for Groucho on stage when Groucho had appendicitis. So in some cases, this story was kind of transposed mistakenly to the film. In other cases, I suppose it was taken as a kind of a precedent. He did it then, so he may as well have done it that time too. And this story has certainly gone far and wide. I blush on behalf of the British Film Institute, my erstwhile employer, but it is very much stated as fact in a British Film Institute piece online that it is Zeppo. But I think it's an error, as I said, partly for that reason, but also because the people that tended to be advancing the Zeppo theory tended not to realize that we're actually seeing three doubles, not one. Chico, Harpo, and Groucho are all doubled. And I think we witnessed something of the awesome power of self-suggestion when a lot of the Zeppoites go on to say, and you can tell by Groucho's voice, there's a slightly different tone to his voice. No, you can't. No, it is Groucho's voice. They're miming. That's very clear when you see the exaggerated gestures, and also a moment where Groucho nods repeatedly, waiting for the soundtrack to catch up with the reason why he's nodding. So it is a playback of the real soundtrack, the real guys on the soundtrack. But the main reason why it's not Zeppo is just take a look at the guy. We'll put some pictures on the blog page, but it's clearly not Groucho, and it's clearly not Zeppo. It's a man, whoever he is, with a very distinctive face. So my assumption when I wrote the annotated was that it was their stage doubles, and that was how I proceeded, and I attempted to name them, because it didn't seem to me that it would be any kind of in-joke. The idea of Zeppo doing it was that it was kind of an in-joke, but then once you factor in Harpo and Chico, no, not so. So that's what I did. I think we got Harpo and Chico right. I know we didn't get Groucho right. But funnily enough, we've now gone back to wondering if there might be a little bit of in-jokery going on after all.
Yeah.
Don't worry, no Zeppo will be harmed in the explanation that follows. But Stewart Tryster, tell us more.
Okay, this is where I try to justify the big bucks you're paying me for coming on again. And I'll tell you, I mean, there's stuff, I don't know if you're going to know everything that I'm about to say, or at least a couple of things. But one of them that I find most interesting, I only discovered a few hours ago. I mean, less than 3 hours before we were scheduled to start the podcast. So basically, yeah, we've got a fake Harpo and a fake Chico, and we've got a fake Groucho. And we have learnt in the meantime, this also connects to a storm that took place when they were shooting this for the first time, and that knocked out all the sound equipment, etc. And I'll read you in a moment the bit where Herman is quoted as saying, "Well, we'll do this another day." I think everybody who looks at it seriously can see, and of course it's not Groucho, of course it's not Zeppo. Now, I'll already mention what I think might be going on here, and this is what I'm going to be working on, and this is the question of could it be Arthur Sheikman, and why? In terms of hairline and ears, it does kind of match. Well, the little we can see, we're not supposed to be seeing too much. We do get enough profile to see it's not Zeppo for sure. Height is another question, as Bob pointed out in the preliminary discussions here. This guy is at least as tall as Margaret Dumont, whereas Groucho is a bit shorter in the scenes we can see them. And now there has been another interesting question that's come up that we know now that Groucho's understudy during the Animal Crackers run on stage was Sam Goldman, who presumably was a pretty good physical match for Groucho as an understudy. But the pictures I've seen of him don't seem to match so much what we've got on the screen there. And in any case, it seems that Goldman and the Marx Brothers went their separate ways before the filming began. With Sheikman, almost the opposite happens, and that's the interesting thing. Now, the reason I'm going to go over this, one of the most forceful arguments that I've heard against it being Sheikman, whether if he was there, available, or if it's physically enough like him, is the claim that he simply was not close enough with Groucho. Their acquaintance was still too recent for that to have been a possibility. And I think that's something we can kind of put to rest. So there's like 3 different chronologies to get in order here, and we'll just work our way down through them. Part of it's backwards. The really fun stuff at the end is backwards. We've got the items that appeared after the film came out, or as it was about to come out. The earliest one I've seen is from 24th of October 1930, where it says the Animal Crackers storm was disrupted by a real storm. Believe it or not, a real thunderstorm spoiled one of the storm scenes while Animal Crackers, the new Marx Brothers comedy feature due at Loew's Valencia Theatre tomorrow for a week's run, was being recorded at the Paramount New York studios. The sequence shows Chico and Harpo Marx removing a painting from its frame during a storm, which has put out the lights at the country house where the Marx Brothers are guests. Arc lamps were being switched on and off to simulate lightning, and the property man was producing artificial thunder when a sudden spring storm burst over the studio. Cut, shouted director Victor Herman. We'll finish the storm scene when the storm's over. The explanation for this paradox is that lightning produces static in the delicate microphones to such an extent as to make voices of the actors completely inaudible. Now shooting began, as far as I can tell, the week that began on the 28th of April 1930. There were a couple of days of rehearsal first, and then by midweek they were actually shooting. That's what it seems. I also looked at the weather. Yeah, on the 1st of May, there was one man killed in Queens by a thunderstorm, struck by lightning.
It wasn't Zeppo, was it? No,
no, it wasn't Zeppo. So it could have been very early on. One of the still unsolved mysteries, let's assume we accept these were not the Marx Brothers, and the soundtrack is the Marx Brothers. What was coming first? Now, Matthew mentioned that one of the actors is waiting for the soundtrack to catch up, as if it had to be a pre-recorded. I don't know for absolute certain that it has to be that way. Could it have been something that they shot silent, and then when they had the Marx Brothers there, did it? I don't know. This is something still to be looked at.
There was also a time during the filming where things had to be held up for a week or so. Harpo and Chico were both in the hospital or both ill. They had some physical malady. So that might have been why they might not have been available to do a physical thing, because Harpo has to hang from the curtains and so forth.
Yes, he had an operation, and so even when he came back, he would have been pretty tender and probably not up to that, yeah.
I get the impression that they filmed it with the Marx Brothers, and then for some reason they needed to redo it. It was too dark, it was too light, it was out of focus, there was something that wasn't framed right. For some reason they needed to redo it. And either the director said, this is going to be so dark, nobody's going to notice it if it's not really Groucho, or the Marxes just weren't available and didn't show up that day. We don't know. We can make a case either way.
I can do better now. Okay, let's look at illness. There's a piece, I think this is one of the, there's more than one piece. The one I've actually got on screen in front of me here is from the Philadelphia Inquirer, 20th of July, 1930. Okay, it says Harpo and Chico Marx have finished their scenes in Animal Crackers, the new starring Paramount vehicle of the four Marx Brothers, in the face of severe physical disability, thus giving another illustration of the theatrical maxim, the show must go on. Harpo is just out of a hospital after an operation necessitated by an enlarged gland in his neck. Chico is suffering from a painful kidney disorder. Film Daily, 23rd of June, tells us that Harpo was horizontal for a month. That's a long time to be off.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in Variety on July the 2nd, 1930, it says that Harpo has been okayed for work from that same day, July the 2nd. 2 days' work are needed. Now here it gets fun. And we go back a little bit. Exhibitors Herald World, 21st of June 1930. The completion of Animal Crackers has been temporarily delayed by the sudden illness of, in quotation marks, Groucho Marx. Aha. The large staff of physicians who have been in attendance on him have not yet decided whether it's appendicitis or just something he ate. And the 28th of June 1930 is, again, in quotation marks from the Exhibitors Herald World, quotation marks, Groucho Marx, will soon be on his feet again, and they'll all be able to put the finishing touches on Animal Crackers. So we're looking at almost 2 weeks' absence by Groucho as well. 3 Marx Brothers knocked out at about the same time. You say, well, it could be, except Groucho and Sheikman didn't even know each other well enough, and what the hell was he, doing there? The thing about it is, Groucho and Sheikman collaborated on a sketch for the Max Gordon review, Three's a Crowd. And the show is first announced, how early? On the 21st of May in Variety, Max Gordon's new show. Max Gordon is either proposing a new Broadway show with music for himself or acting as caster for it. So far, reported engaged by Gordon are Libby Holman, Fred Allen, and Clifton Webb. All 3 principals were in the first little show hit in New York. So we've gotten that far. And we know the dates of Animal Crackers, when it began, when it finished. We have a pretty good idea about when the 3 of them were sick. And we know the names of both of the Chico and Harpo doubles. Variety, July the 2nd, 1930. Sheikman quits column, Chicago, July the 1st. Arthur Sheikman, AGS, conductor of the Times gossip column, leaves for New York this week to join Metro's publicity. He will handle trailers. Sheikman has been a Chicago film critic and columnist for 5 years. It gets better. Variety, nearly a month earlier, 4th of June, 1930. Art Sheikman is vacationing the next 3 weeks in New York and on the tip of Cape Cod. So here is Groucho's collaborator, who he's worked on this sketch with, who he's known, well, we don't know exactly how long yet properly, but they're already close enough to have collaborated, it seems, and he happens to be there at just the time, on the spot, when Groucho and Chico and Harpo are all unavailable to perform this scene. And you think it, if all 3 of them are sick at the same time, what is more natural than for Victor Herman to say, hell, what can we do? We've done everything else we can without them, but this scene's in the dark. Let's do that. And Sheikman, why would Sheikman not do this? Or why would he? Let's see. Now we go back to the beginning of the year. Variety, 19th of February, 1930. At Ben Burney's final night in the Balloon Room at the Congress, Eddie Cantor, George M. Cohn, and Sophie Tucker did stunts. The Marx Brothers were upstairs, talking to Ben Hecht. So Cantor, Harry Rubin, the songster, Ed Sorin, and Art Sheikman, the gossipy columnist, took the bows as Groucho, Chico, et al. So what we now have proof of now is that before shooting began, Sheikman doubling as a Marx brother was already a kind of in-joke with them. And of course, he also did his little shtick in horse feathers, though not as a Marx brother. So most of the major objections to the possibility of Sheikman, there's an answer to them. So open it up now. Did you guys know Groucho was sick, or did I just discover that today?
I never knew that, and to be honest, I'm almost thinking, were they, for the three of them to be off at the same time? One wonders perhaps if they were even off doing something else, and that story was put out. But in any event, no, I didn't know that. And just one sort of subsidiary point to make about Sheikman, as you said, yes, he does have form in jokey appearances because he is in horse feathers for no good reason. But the other thing is, when we, and we'll put some pictures on the blog, as I said, but when we say that Sheikman resembles that man in the dark, we're not saying, man A resembles man B. Sheikman is an extremely distinctive character. He has a very distinctive hairline. He has very distinctive ears. And the guy in the dark has both of those things.
Yeah.
The hairline's just so similar. It doesn't look like someone made up to be Groucho with the hairline. It looks like Sheikman's hairline. A lot.
Yeah.
And you checked the weather forecast from when Sheikman was in New York?
No.
By the way, for those who want to look at this and investigate it on their own, I recommend you look for the old DVD version, because that one is printed quite a bit lighter than the restoration, where they did darken it up, maybe to hide this or to be more accurate. But the DVD version is somewhat brighter, and it's easier to make out.
Brighter, yes, but the resolution never gets really good when you're trying to enlarge that tiny head.
Right, right.
Monkey business. There has always been the question of the two Frenchies. Frenchie supposedly is at the dock waving at the ship, and back on the ship waving at the dock. So Frenchie is in effect waving at himself. But as anyone who's looked carefully at the film knows, he isn't. He's only on the dock. He's not on the ship. But the story that he is in some way, somewhere also on the ship, has persisted. So Stewart, again, can you enlighten us a little more on the possibility of the second Frenchie?
All right. This is something I found and had intended to post on the council website and just on the council Facebook page, and just didn't get around to it so long until you said, hey, can you be on the Mysteries podcast? And I thought, hell, I'm saving this. So I did. I have not been systematically searching out every foreign language book about the Marx Brothers, but a couple of months ago, I think it was, I was simply at the library, and I went to the cinema section at that point, and there's a German book on the Marx Brothers staring at me. I'll tell you the one it was. It's still next to me here.
Well, now, if you were systematically searching out every foreign language book on the Marx Brothers, you'd tell us, right?
Yeah. Film up die Marx Brothers, not die Marx Brothers.
And sometimes Zeppo.
Yeah, it basically means roll the film. The author is Manfred Hopsch. I pulled it up and I thought, okay, I figure content-wise, there probably isn't that much this can tell me that I don't know, but every book has a different selection of pictures, so I started just flipping there's some really nice stills here I've never seen. And very, very close to the beginning, on page 11, I see a picture that makes me, I would have stopped in my tracks if I had been walking at the time. And it was a picture which I guess I've scanned it, and you guys can put it up after the podcast is released so people know what we're talking about.
No, let's let people imagine it.
Yeah. On the left, it's on the deck of the ship. You can see the lifeboats hanging. And there's Harpo and Chico, and they're holding the chessboard between them. Harpo has his finger to his mouth in a shh gesture. And they're both looking at two other people in the scene, to their left, the picture there. And one is obviously Frenchie. And he is engaged in some kind of animated conversation with somebody who I had the same first instinct as Bob did when he saw this picture. He said, is that Zeppo? I don't think it is. It looks like an old...
He's wearing a beret.
He's wearing a beret. I haven't compared his clothing, but looking closely enough at the face, no, I think it isn't, because his face is only quarter profiled we see here. But the thing about it is, in the movie, we see them interrupt the chess game or take it over and take it away. And the next time we see them in the chess game, it's when they go into Joe Helton's cabin with it, unannounced, and just start playing on his bed. And we've never seen anything else there. So presumably this was a deleted scene that was filmed in between those two. Now, is
Frenchie wearing the same outfit that he is on the dock?
It looks familiar, yeah. I mean, I haven't compared it literally, but it looks the same to me from just looking at it. Anyway, there is this earlier Monkey Business script that's floating around, the one that's been useful to us. You remember those couple of stills where Groucho at the party was doing that trick with an egg?
Yes.
And they filled in what that gag had been?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I went to that, and unfortunately, it says in the transcript of that script, 3 pages missing at the end of the captain's cabin scene with Groucho and Chico until the beginning of the scene in the character who is later Helton, but in this early version is still called Joe Farina. At the beginning of that scene takes up. So that is missing. So presumably there must be some earlier version of the script somewhere that we can actually find out what was going on, because it may... Now we've seen the picture that tells us it's Frenchie. It may have been a moment in the script that someone would have reading think, oh, this is not a big deal. Who cares if they cut it out? Because it just says 2 men are having a discussion or something, and Chico and Harpo shush them or something like that. Not realizing, of course, that one of the men is their father, Frenchie. So that was an interesting thing for me to discover.
It's also noteworthy that now that we know Frenchie was involved in a scene here in Monkey Business that didn't make it into the film, this could be the origin of the anecdote about him being on the ship and also on the pier.
Oh, sure, yeah.
In the memories of the brothers themselves and everyone else who made the film, he indeed was on the ship. I also can't help but think, looking at this photo you've unearthed, how much Frenchie here is reminiscent of the older Groucho, the You Bet Your Life era Groucho.
I see what you mean, yeah.
His height, his posture, his stance, the way his clothes fit him.
Everything about him reminds you of him.
Indeed.
Of course, what we don't know is whether this was an actual moment in the film or a kind of a posed thing for the... Or it could have been something else similar going on, but not exactly that.
Yeah, and it is interesting how I mean, I agree with your insight about the question of whether this other guy is Zeppo, but it's not 100% satisfying that it isn't. Right? Do you see it that way too? It seems like
I also think it'd be lovely for him to be with his son, with his kids.
Lovely, yeah. Yeah.
If it is Zeppo, it's an off-duty Zeppo, though, isn't it?
I would say so, yeah. An off-duty Zeppo. And you know how much trouble they can be. But it's strange to see a picture of somebody in profile and have any doubt about whether it's Zeppo, but something about the angle here.
If it was proper profile, there would be no doubt, but it isn't. It's not complete profile, is it?
I just think he looks slightly extreme. I think he looks like a Paramount caricature of Zeppo. He's just a bit too Zeppo-ish for me.
I'm not satisfied that it is or isn't, but I think maybe it's Irving Brecker as Zeppo.
Got a big schnoz, yeah.
He has, yeah.
Yeah, but it's all about how you use it.
If we find a script and it tells us a moment that doesn't involve a Zeppo character, then we kind of know it can't be. Because Zeppo has already been introduced to us as one of the Stokers.
Yes. The fact that they are carrying that chessboard strongly suggests that it is based in some part on a scene.
Perhaps what we need to do is go back and see if that beret guy appears somewhere on the ship as an extra.
Yeah, I haven't done that yet. It is absolutely worth looking to see whether this extra, like with that dress, with that dark beret on, shows up anywhere.
I feel like there is some other documentation of Zeppo in a beret like that. Am I making that up?
There is one of him, I think, with Chico at an eating place, some restaurant or something.
Okay.
So he might have just been on the set when they took that still, perhaps. But I don't think it is him.
It might have been like, here, Dad, come on, we'll take a picture, pretend we're doing a scene here.
Yeah.
Okay, I just want to ask a very, very quick question about horse feathers, because this is points up my ignorance more than anything else. But we know that the finale where the college was burnt down was filmed because there are stills of it. And we've argued in an earlier podcast that probably the cutaways of Harpo shoveling books might have come from that sequence too. So we definitely know it was filmed. It doesn't appear to have survived. What I want to know is there a general rule for this kind of thing? When a scene is shot and cut out, is it arbitrary whether it's saved or not? Because it seems to me that a lot of stuff that has been cut out does get saved, and it turns up in documentaries, and it turns up particularly. I always cite the That's Entertainment films, which are full of musical numbers that have been cut out of films.
Yeah, MGM was always big on that. That's another reason why I don't think the Dr. Hackenbush song was ever filmed. It certainly would have been included in one of those compilations.
But then, why haven't they got the At the Circus courtroom scene?
Maybe they just watched it and decided to spare us.
I think probably every studio did have its own policy, but I think what has survived has been a lot to do with like random chance that since then, and a lot of stuff was junked at later dates that might have been kept originally for a while.
Yeah. So in fact, actually, let's skip here. In fact, because the only thing I wanted to ask about Go West was the song there that survives all the way into the opening credits.
Okay.
But isn't featured.
I think one of the reasons is because if you've listened to the song itself, you realize the melody's still in there, and maybe they were contractually obligated to give a credit. That's playing behind that first love scene, basically, after the wonderful horse shot.
Yes, my favourite shot, the only shot really for me that makes Go West a going concern. All right, well, let's trundle back to Duck Soup. I think we covered the Big Bad Wolf in sufficient detail in one of our earlier shows. If you're interested in that,
I got one thing I think belongs more between Horse Feathers and Duck Soup, though. If I may.
Yep, go on. Yep, go.
And it's a kind of a query. It's not a mystery per se, but it's something that makes me wonder. Why the hell not? They seem to be such naturals for a classic children's story. And I find it amazing that as Paramount's possibly biggest comedians, W.C. Fields included then, but how come their name was never ever mentioned for the All-Star Alice in Wonderland? That seems odd to me that it would never even come up. That was never even said they've rejected or nothing suitable has been found or that it just zero. I've never found anything about it, and that strikes me as odd. Why on earth not? And this was in preparation even before the problems of Duck Soup, shall we say?
And I always thought it was odd by the same token, given that they're in House That Shadows Built. I always thought it was strange that they're not in Paramount on Parade. Which again, you would think would be a shoe-in.
Yeah.
Were they considered too adult, or?
But look at who they did get. I mean, Fields is in there, and you got adult. You got, stars for grown-ups, not just child oriented. You've got everything in there. It seems weird that nobody Paramount, the heads of Paramount are making this. Who are our big stars? Who are our big who are crowd pleasers that nobody ever thought of or mentioned publicly or even got a rejection for? It just strikes me as I don't get it. I keep on looking occasionally to think, is something going to come out?
You would think at least maybe one or two of them alone might have done it. If Groucho wasn't interested, I'm sure Chico wouldn't have passed it up.
Although you'd think Groucho would have been the most interested. He was a big admirer of Lewis Carroll, and isn't there a reference in Animal Crackers to the Walrus and the Carpenter?
There is, yes.
Yeah.
So speaking of child-related subjects, well, I think we've moving on to Duck Soup now. I think we've covered the Big Bad Wolf in sufficient detail in previous shows. We'll make a note on the blog of which ones those are. If you're thinking, what Big Bad Wolf? What is this man talking about? We'll let you know on the blog. Another thing which we have brought up in the past, but I think we're duty bound to do it again, is the presence of Leo McCarey somewhere in the film. The possible presence of Leo McCarey somewhere in the film as a kind of an in-jokey cameo, something again like Sheikman he did have form in doing, but we've never been able to spot him, and it's one of Bob's
not with certainty
quests.
Anyway.
Yes, we've never been able to, absolutely.
For those just jumping in, we have found a couple of newspaper clippings indicating that Leo McCarey shot a cameo during Duck Soup. We've gone through the film with a fine-tooth comb and no luck finding him, or at least nothing with any certainty.
Well, there have been a few interesting candidates where I look and I think, I'm still not sure. And of course, the fact that it might have been shot, if all these rumors about missing Zeppo footage are true, who knows what else, if that ever turns up, could be hiding in it.
Yes, that's right. I mean, it could easily be lost in an edit, but
nobody would have said we can't cut this scene because it's McCarey's cameo, right? Nobody would have said that.
My latest candidate was when Harpo's off on his horse ride as he's going through the village. The peasants going out in their pajamas, running out in the street to look at him. I thought I might have seen him as one of those.
And we've examined the kinds of cameos that McCary used to do to see what, and it doesn't.
I think when Groucho gets the urn stuck on his head, it's actually McCary in
there. Yeah, I mean, my only feeling was it was probably unlikely to be in a chorus, in a sequence that was going to involve him being there a lot, because A, that kind of, goes beyond a joke, and B, it makes it slightly difficult for him as a director. So I very much thought it was going to be here he comes, here he goes. But we did find a report that says he's playing a peasant, which narrows it down.
Matthew, would you have been happy if he was the lemonade vendor?
Yes. a drunken lemonade vendor, yes.
And we did contact some relatives of his, and they knew nothing.
Descendants, right?
Yeah. They knew nothing and cared nothing. Yeah.
Yeah. And then I think they changed their number, didn't they?
Yeah, they said they didn't like it so much.
Okay, let's move on to the MGM films then. And before looking at any detail, let's just talk very briefly about the roadshow tours, which we know were a big part of the Thalberg deal. Opera went on the road, races went on the road, and many years later, Night in Casablanca went on the road. We have some photographs of Day at the Races, but not much else, and we have nothing else of the others. Why?
Although we know that Go West was even filmed on 16mm.
Yes, sorry, I forgot to mention Go West. Yes, that's right. But we don't, apart from a few pictures of the races show, which makes it look like taking pictures of it is no big deal, because here's a few of those. We have nothing else.
Well, there's behind the scenes of opera, like there's them arriving at Salt Lake City, and there's other stuff, but nothing with them in costume performing.
Right.
And the really bizarre thing is, what was the reason for these tours? They were testing the material. It must have been important for them, even if they didn't do 16mm like Go West for everyone, to document these things. So like, okay, we're doing this scene, it worked. Well, how was it set up on the stage? Have you got a photo, right?
Yeah, reference points, yeah.
It does seem impossible and even suspicious that there is not more surviving evidence of these tours.
And the one that gets me the most is Night in Casablanca, where they did it in an army base in front of thousands of people, apparently.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the technology by then is cheaper to take snapshots and stuff.
Yeah, there's lots and lots of photos of Hollywood stars visiting army bases and performing in front of soldiers. That's not a rarity.
But we do have to remember these were like Broadway previews where they wanted to maintain some secrecy. So they probably said no to reporters and photographers.
Yeah, I'm not thinking reporters when I say what I say. I'm thinking either of their own internal documentation so they know what they were doing, so they have a record of, some kind of record to help them remember how things worked, plus snapshots or, maybe after the show posing in costume with audience members if they agreed to do that. They must have been besieged by fans, if they
probably
were...
not so much by the time of the Go West tour, but in the early days, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
No mystery why record of the Go West tour doesn't survive. But what about the others?
Okay, let's look specifically at A Night at the Opera then, and one of the most interesting questions for me that kind of permeates the whole business of the two versions that we've discussed before, the version that survives in Hungary, I think, and the less complete one that we're familiar with, is the reason seems to be references to Italy. That what has been cut throughout have been references to where the fact that the film is set, and for some reason, sometime, somewhere, someone didn't want us to know, or at least to be constantly reminded, that a great deal of the film takes place in Italy and that the characters are all Italians, not just Chico, but Harpo and Alan Jones as well.
And the irony of all this is that the one thing they did have a legitimate case about, Chico's character, was the one thing they couldn't do anything about.
There's nothing you can do about it, and there's nothing you can do about their surnames. So it does seem, right from the start, before you even begin to look at why it was done and who did it, it does seem like an astonishingly futile endeavor.
Yeah.
So I think that's the idea. It wasn't so much that this cannot have any references to Italy, because that would have invalidated the whole film. It's more like somebody said, look, can we just dial down the Italian a bit here? Can we just make this a bit less Italian? That seems to be what has happened, and that in itself, to my mind, argues against the most common explanation, which is that the cuts deal from a wartime reissue, when Italy was an enemy power, was an Axis power, and it was taken out for that reason, because nobody would want to see sympathetic Italians at a time when Italians were the enemy. What we did a lot of research into, and the conclusion that I still stand by, is that it wasn't done then, it was done earlier. And it was done for the opposite reason, which is so as not to offend Italian audiences, who were very, very volatile. There's all sorts of reports of Hollywood films pissing off Italians around this time. They just seem to have it, a thorn in their paw about these things. And also, of course, because America also had obviously a large Italian American audience as well. So there are all kinds of things that are cut very early on. There's a line, "You can't Mussolini all of us," that gets cut. There's, of course, the three aviators whose nationality is not named, and then the cut-in of the newspaper makes it look as though they're Greek. They were originally Italians, and a pretty close parody that people would have got at the time of Balbo, the Italian airman. So these things are all going on very, very early, and my feeling is that it was all done early. We have a Variety report from 1936 that says Italian censors have KO'd A Night at the Opera for native consumption as NG for the Italian temperament, no good for the Italian temperament. So this was a problem straight away. Italians were annoyed about this. They were annoyed also at the disrespectful use of opera, which was something that they took very seriously as one of their great contributions to world culture. Was it Variety? No, it's the Milwaukee Journal says that they lampoon that most sacred of all subjects, Italian opera. So my feeling is that this was done early, and that it was done to appease Italian sensibilities. But then that opens up a whole new can of worms. How early? Because it's done very, very crudely. It's not done in a way that one would expect MGM to want that film to go out. It's done with a hacksaw. So when? What do we think?
You wonder whether Thalberg could have been alive for that to happen, to let that happen.
Although we do have to remember that this was likely only done for one market, and due to some labeling or filing error or whatever, this is the version that survived.
That's right. And I remember we went to great lengths, didn't we, to try and find any contemporary review that mentions that opening song, for instance, which is the most drastic cut. It opened up like it opened like a Chevalier musical, didn't it, where the lines of the song were being handed on from character to character, and it eventually ends up with the waiter that we see at the start of the film.
Just, it's maddening and mysterious, considering the high level of polish on A Night at the Opera, that those cuts are so crude. And that, like, when Chico's line, when he's asked for the singer's name, and he says, the written line is, some Italian name, I can't pronounce it. But as cut, he says, some I can't pronounce it.
Yeah, it's just chopped, isn't it? It's just chopped. And as Stewart says, Thalberg certainly would not have stood for that, surely. So
yeah.
But if I'm not mistaken, I'm not looking at the documentation, I think it was 1938, before the outbreak of war, that the Italians said no more Jewish comedians, said no more Marx Brothers at all.
That's correct.
So it's kind of a narrow window between when it would be worth their while to even bother.
Exactly, yes.
Between Thalberg's death and the time that the Marx Brothers were persona non grata as film personalities in Italy.
So yes, the most convenient date, which I narrowed it down to in terms of where the blocks of history come in, was somewhere in 1936. But that still butts up against the Thalberg problem, this big pet project. Yeah. I can't see him standing for that.
I mean, even if he'd been persuaded it was necessary, he might have insisted on doing retakes or something else.
Yeah.
Other than, I mean, let's face it. If you're not really concerned about some of the Chico, some of the what Noah just mentioned, some of these jump cuts, you don't get them immediately because you're used to watching old movies where there are jump cuts because of the film prints are old. But that all prints, the very first line of dialogue is truncated somehow. That is the killer.
Gentleman
for me.
has not arrived yet. Yeah, yeah.
But to be honest, how many of us really noticed that until we read it later on?
True.
I think I was always aware that this was jumpy and choppy. I thought, end of the credits, and suddenly, gentleman has not arrived yet. And it always struck me, what a shitty print,
I just thought old movie.
Yeah.
Some of the lines, the contract scene I encountered on paper before I ever saw the film in Gene Shalit's anthology, Laughing Matters. He prints the scene, but he prints the scene as written, I suppose. And it has the some Italian name I can't pronounce it line, as well as in the same scene. Groucho asks Chico, are you Italian? And Chico says, no, I sound that way because my mother and father are Italian. So I knew both of those lines before I ever saw the scene, and I missed them on first viewing. When Tom Rocks spoke to us back in episode 6 about his viewing of the Hungarian print, I don't remember. What did he say about the very beginning of the film? It didn't have the musical number.
Same as ours, yeah.
No.
But he did start recognizing the Italian references.
Those jump cuts were gone.
Right.
The jump cuts were gone in the contract scene, but but the same was the Sartazars.
Because it suggests that whole thing was axed crudely before anyone bothered making the other cuts.
And I think that's it. That's it for Night at the Opera. We don't have anything else bothering us about that, do we, Bob?
I wish I had something here.
Did you see the comment on the council's Facebook page?
What's this?
You wrote a mystery, like you plugged that we're about to start recording, and somebody wrote, I don't know if I can take an hour and a half of pondering about the manicurist.
Well, then turn it off now. I wish I had something new to say about our search for the manicurist, other than I have nothing new to say. I'm getting no help from our Hollywood friends. You know who you are. So I guess we're on our own, folks.
I stick with my, what I think about a year and a half ago, I wrote this on a comment somewhere. I wrote, I'm open to ditching the Betty Sanford theory, but only for something that is more likely. That's how I feel. And I know Robert Moulton contacted family and all that, but...
Stewart, I was really open to having her at least as a possibility, something. But after looking at more pictures and stories about her, she's just too old and too short. I just can't go long. Sorry.
Do we know if Arthur Sheikman was in Hollywood at the time?
The one thing I will say is that I'm not as much curious about the identity of the manicurist as the story as to why we don't know her name.
Why she's not identified, yeah.
Did she request it? Did she do something?
They took her out of the credits because it was an Italian name.
The annoying thing is we found so many other reports, didn't we, of real manicurists, real studio manicurists being screen tested. It seems to be like one of those stories that they keep plumping for.
What makes this even more tragic for this lady is that if you look up the Marx Brothers online or in a book or whatever, you're likely going to come across a photo of the stateroom scene with her front and center. It's probably the single most definitive image of their career, and she's the most prominent person in it other than the Marxes. So it's just a shame that her name still escapes us. Now, I said 2019 was going to be the year of the manicurist, but we might have to file an extension.
We're running out of time. Won't somebody please help us? Can't you see Bob is suffering?
Okay.
On A Night at the Opera, Harpo speaks. He has this couple of pages at least description of his tour to promote the movie, which we find no trace of anywhere. And it sounds like it's totally invented.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a thing that's... I keep on wanting to find one clipping that will match something that Harpo says in that couple of pages, and I find nothing. We know that there was maybe timing to do with his relationship with Susan or something that he wanted, because it was very linked at that point. It was like he took the tour to get away from the pressure of having to make a commitment and stuff like that, make a decision. Fine, but and he tells some specific stories, which I guess must have taken place at different times.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, are we all agreed that nobody's ever found any evidence that that was anything, that tour ever took place?
Nothing at
I've
all.
never seen anything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And obviously you would think that if anything was going to get reported, it would be a promotional tour. That's what they're for.
It's
isn't it?
for publicity. Keep it quiet.
So that is a very strange, which needs a lot of, I think, would reward a lot of future investigation. But
Though the explanation presumably has only to do with him covering up his personal affairs in a way that makes sense somehow.
Well, maybe personal affair is not the phrase you want to use.
Well, no, I mean his nervousness about Susan or something.
Yeah.
Right. I want to just briefly talk about the line in Day at the Races, the famous line where Groucho says,
I told you guys to stay down in that room with those pigeons.
Obviously, it refers to something that's no longer there. When the horse comes in, there's a pigeon on it. So there's something that's got lost in the various stages by which that film came about. That's perhaps not particularly remarkable, except that it seems to me that we have so much documentation about that film, so many different drafts going all the way back to when it had almost nothing to do with it as it eventually appeared. So it just seems like there's just nothing. There's nothing anywhere to account for these pigeons. They intrigue me.
Yeah, before we started recording, I went and I just listened to it again, like take a fresh look at the thing. And one thing did strike me. It's the way that Groucho says the line.
I told you guys to stay down in that room with those pigeons.
And he puts a huge emphasis really on the word pigeons. And it strikes me that what is going on? I mean, after all, the horse does end up coming in with the pigeons. The horse is the one who's the fugitive from justice here. The horse is the one who can't be mentioned. It seems to me like he's saying pigeons because he cannot say horse under those circumstances. And presumably, yeah, Matthew must have it right. I mean, there must be some kind of deleted sequence or part of a scene at least, maybe a continuation of the one that fades out before, where pigeons kind of by the way happen to be in there and they're used as the reference.
So they're not really strongly relevant. It's just that he's using that. So in a sense, he's saying that in the same way that he would say "ixnay on the horse hay."
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Yeah. There's always the slight possibility that it might just be a non sequitur. Like it might be brilliantly absurd that there's a reference to pigeons that doesn't seem apropos of anything. Yeah, on the other hand, it might be the wreckage of a creative process that went off the rails.
Yeah. I don't remember the walrus scene cut out of Animal Crackers.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Right. But if an actual walrus kind of galumphed across the screen, it would add to our impression that something was intended. This article was discovered by Bob Gassell. It's from the Dayton Herald, Dayton, Ohio, June 29th, 1937. It was written by none other than Alan Jones, or someone wrote it for him, perhaps. And he's relaying some of his memories of working with the brothers on Day at the Races. He says, I've seen those three take 3 days to work out a sequence that looks like 3 minutes in the script. For instance, Groucho had an idea that he should open a window and some pigeons would fly out. But the pigeons just sat there and refused to play. So the back of the drawer had to be removed so that a man could stand behind and give the pigeons a shoo. S-H-O-O. Mm-hmm. That moved the window too far away from the wall, so a hole had to be cut in the wall through which the man could shoo his shoe. Then Chico thought it would be still funnier if some rabbits should pop out of another prop, and Harpo wanted some pigs in still a third prop. Well, if watching that sort of thing go on for months at a time doesn't drive you as insane as the Marxes are, you've gone through your baptism of fire all right.
Well, first let me point out that I can't imagine Zeppo writing that article, so...
Maybe Kenny Baker.
Can I ask, did Alan Jones have a habit of any sort? Was he a bit of a was he a secret drinker? I mean, Harpo wanted a pig.
Well, do you remember what Frank told us in our Day at the Races episode?
Alan Jones had a VHS, and he was working up until the end of his life, and it was just his scenes from the Marx Brothers movies. Everything else was cut out. It was just the Alan Jones scenes. And I worked with an actress in Groucho Life in Review. I remember she was in San Bernardino at the California Theater, and she told me that story of sitting there and watching Alan Jones scenes from A Night at the Opera and A Day at the Races. That's. I think if I go to hell, and it's likely, I'll be there with Alan watching those clips.
So yeah, apparently he was a character.
Yeah. But I guess this all does point towards a deleted scene, as you mentioned.
Well, part of a scene. It could be the thing we don't know is what room the horse came from. Was he still in Groucho's bedroom closet? Mm-hmm. Or was he moved to another place where there were pigeons? I mean, that scene does fade out. There could have been a chunk missing somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
What Stewart was saying though does I think point very convincingly to the fact of the pigeons being in that bit was of no particular significance. I like that.
Other than that they were in the same place as the horse. Yeah.
Yeah, but he could just easily have said with those cushions, or with that windowsill, or anything
with
else.
That straw.
Yes.
Yeah. With the remains of my mattress. Yeah.
It kind of does make it an absurd idea. I mean, Jones introduces the idea of pigeons by saying Groucho had an idea that he should open a window. I mean, it seems to be a drawer, actually, not a window, but he should open a window or a drawer and some pigeons would fly out. It doesn't sound like a particularly inspired comic notion, unless maybe it was based in something else in the script that we're just not being told here.
Mm-hmm.
Also, I'm wondering about out and in, since we don't know whether the place that the horse was immediately before the examination scene was outdoors or indoors. Do they fly out? Do they fly in, really? I'm not quite sure how. It's a little hard to visualize exactly from the way the piece is written that Noah just read out.
Or maybe is it somehow tied into Groucho being a veterinarian and having all these animals in his charge? We don't, I guess, see that happening in the sanitarium. But in his first scene in Florida, doesn't he have a puppy in his sleeve and things like that?
Yeah. Have we ever cased that scene to make sure there are no pigeons lurking in the background that could have come with him?
Maybe they flew over from the park bench scene in A Night at the Opera.
I think the biggest mystery with A Day at the Races is the famous Dr. Hackenbush song, which, as we all know, was at some point intended for inclusion and isn't included. What we don't know is why, what happened to it, and what we don't know for certain is how far it got before it was taken out. Was it filmed or not? I have a very strong conviction there, but it's not documented. Bob, you've got some thoughts on this, I think.
Okay, while it's impossible to prove something didn't happen, there seems to be very strong evidence that the number was never shot. First, let's talk about the song's origin. It was written by Bert Kalmar and Harry Ruby for a very early draft of the film that they did. And while that script was soon abandoned, the song was held on to, probably because Groucho liked it, I'm assuming. When the road tour was done, Groucho sang the song, but when it came time to actually shoot the film, the song was dropped for reasons that I'll get into in a minute. But MGM and Groucho still liked the song and used it as a promotional tool on the radio show they did when the film came out. Some people claim that the song was in the film but cut out, but as far as evidence goes, it was never really part of the film, because look at the finale. They're marching on the track and they're reprising songs from earlier in the film, and Dr. Hackenbush is not reprised. Actually, another song that was physically cut from the film is reprised there. So, but Dr. Hackenbush isn't.
Yes, exactly. Groucho does do a little song reprise, and it's not his.
But the biggest evidence we have is that there's absolutely no place where the song would fit. Groucho's entrance is low-key, and there's no real context for a big production number there. So if the song had ever been intended to be there, the scene would have been staged and conceived totally differently. So by now you're probably saying, okay, we get it. The number was never shot, but why? Well, the answer is pretty simple. Believe it or not, it just doesn't fit Groucho's character here. A big part of the plot of A Day at the Races is Groucho's attempts to hide his background and his unsuitability for the job. But in the song, he's basically bragging about it.
I've won a claim for curing ills, both in the north and south. You'll find my name is like my pills in everybody's mouth. I've never lost a case.
He's never lost a case.
I've lost a lot of patients, but I've never lost a case. My diagnosis never fails. I know just what to do. Whenever anybody ails, I'm sympathetic too. My heart within me melts. His heart within him melts. No matter what I treat him for, they die from something else.
While this was totally in line with the Paramount Groucho, this was not the rational character that MGM demanded.
And although things change a little bit in At the Circus, in the Thalberg films, Groucho doesn't sing, you know? Yeah. The songs in Opera and Races are almost diegetic. The opera singers sing in Night at the Opera, and it's always a context of, I think we'll sing a song now. And so it seems that although Arthur Marx, I think, suggests not very convincingly that the song was cut because Groucho didn't care to work on it, which makes very little sense. It does seem like the answer, as you suggest, Bob, is sort of hiding in plain sight, that this song just belongs in a different movie. And if it had been included, I think we'd all be happy about it. I don't think we would say, wait a minute, this is not consistent with the rest of his character as presented in this film. But it truly isn't. Kalmar and Ruby seem to have taken the assignment as, let's pastiche Hooray for Captain Spaulding and make it about a doctor instead of an explorer.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point you just made, Noah, about the diegetic use of music, that in Opera and Races, you only have the diegetic, and that could even
Wait, can we hold on a second while I look up that word, please?
Diegetic, music that is real in the context of the piece. Like, you only hear a song when it's somebody singing a song in a nightclub.
Okay, got it.
I think that the Man in the Moon number, the way it would have been, I mean, and recording does exist of that. Alan Jones's soundtrack recording exists of that, but I believe that was just simply sung to Judy, right?
To cheer her up or something?
I don't know, but it would have been non-diegetic, is what I'm saying. And maybe that's another reason. Maybe they took a decision and said, we're axing this for that reason, the same reason as Hackenbush.
Got it.
It kind of straddles the line, because when in opera, when Kitty Carlisle and Alan Jones sing Alone, it is like, oh, please sing us a song.
Yep,
and yet the music does come out of nowhere. So it's sort of presented like a musical, and it's sort of diegetic.
It's borderline case, if you like, but it certainly got an excuse, a rationale in the plot.
When Groucho sings Ho for the Open Highway, that's diegetic.
Yeah, I think there are two points to be made about how it doesn't fit. I mean, obviously, in terms of the plot, Groucho is pretending to be something he isn't, and in the song he's being, he's sort of boldly stating the opposite. And one could still sort of get around it by saying, once that song starts, the background kind of fades, strange interlude style, and he's kind of singing to us. You could kind of make that case, but at the same time, you also have to remember that his character genuinely doesn't get any pleasure out of his subterfuge in this film. One of the most sort of unfortunate things is that he's such a cringing, sheepish character throughout. And he feels guilty. He feels this tremendous guilt that he's taken this job and is now letting poor Judy down. So it is totally out of character. So I think yes, that, and then when you add to that the fact that there are no stills, and when you add to that the fact that at the end Groucho does a song reprise and it's not that song, it's a different one. To me, that's about as convincing as you can get without proof.
Pretty much, yeah.
Okay, one thing that I wanted to this is an exercise in self-restraint here, because what I don't want to do now is pile into Groucho in At the Circus, but I do want your opinions on just quite what's going on with new Groucho, the new Coke of Marx Brothers in At the Circus, because yes, he's wearing an unpleasant wig, but there's much more to it than that. He just looks different, doesn't he? His face looks different. It's a different shape. He looks like his makeup is slightly different, or perhaps the lighting is slightly different. He looks like a different man. He's doing a different voice. His body language is different. We do know that this was supposedly under direction from Edward Bozell, but even so, there's more to it than that. He's strange.
Is it possible that he knew that the the quality in the material was not there and he was just overcompensating, trying to sell it?
Possibly, but he seems so happy in the big store, doesn't he? Going back to being himself. There is an element of duress, I think, in those two movies. But also just his face. I mean, his face seems longer, thinner. I don't know if he'd gone on a crash diet, maybe, or
the specific and rather unpleasant bag of tricks he employs in these two films are never seen elsewhere. I mean, it's not the only time we've seen him grappling with substandard material, but these two films are the only time he deals with it that way.
Makes you wonder what Bazell was asking him to do, and it tells you for the first one, if Bazell managed to institute that, he could only have gotten away with it with Leroy's agreement.
But it underlines, I think, just how still Groucho is in those early films. If you look at him, for instance, in the wooing scenes with Margaret Dumont and compare that with the At the Circus wooing scene, he's very, very still and measured. And here he's all over the place. He's buzzing. His arms are moving. His legs are moving. He's standing up. He's sitting down. It is a deliberate, very different way of performing.
And isn't it strange, and maybe coincidental, but certainly strange, that in a way, this Groucho from At the Circus and Go West, in a way, this is the popular misconception of Groucho. It's as though these two films are more widely seen than the others, because people remember him and often impersonate him as though he was like this, as though he was more hyperactive, more manic, more shrill, and sort of this mugging, excessively ingratiating attempt at being a sort of crowd-pleasing entertainer, which he was not.
It's almost as if Julius wasn't Groucho and was trying to do an imitation of him.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, he's like a Groucho impersonator.
I wonder whether there's a kind of apart from like whatever Bazell was bringing to it, a kind of a zeitgeist thing where somebody said, hey, this is the swing era now. We got to pep you up, something like that.
Or the amphetamine era, for that matter.
Like what's going on in culture in general.
I mean, it's obvious from the script that he's been rewritten as a kind of a Bob Hope figure, isn't it? Brecker, I think I'm right in saying Brecker wrote for Bob Hope, but certainly Bob Hope is in the air at this point, and he's written like a radio comic for sure. That's certainly obvious from the material. But in terms of performance, I don't know that he's particularly tapping into anything there, is he, other than rank insanity?
Not that I can identify specifically. I mean, we can theorize, he's feeling like he's, not a spring chicken at this point. He's trying to be youthful and bring extra energy to it and show that he's, got every bit the manic energy of younger comics who are coming up now. But
that would be a surprise because, you look at him in the stills and he looks like he wants to die. So the idea of him wanting to put in that extra effort.
Yeah, that's just as hard to imagine as the idea that he was submitting to a director's idea of what his character should be like.
Yeah.
I mean, it does make sense that Bazell had something to do with it because it's the two Bazell films that have this problem. But can you imagine Groucho taking a director's advice and radically changing his screen persona?
Well, what I think is one of the most obvious external visual things, the hair. Now, what is the hair? If you got more hair, if it's not receding, obviously, then you're younger. Maybe there was this push, you got to be younger, you got to appeal to a younger market, you're getting old, you got to fight it, or something like that.
Yeah, maybe.
Which goes with maybe, like, projecting more manic energy somehow. That was all part of a parcel of some kind.
Yeah, it's strange that the performance immediately preceding it in Room Service is so understated. More understated than usual for Groucho. And I wonder if somehow the Room Service experience somehow informed these choices. Doesn't seem like a straight line, but maybe a jagged one.
Part of the problem with Room Service maybe, is you boys have lost energy, perhaps, I don't know. But who I suppose if Mervyn LeRoy said that, I suppose. But then, to go back in Go West and do it again, it just seems strange, to then not do it in the big store,
Well, we solved that one.
Yeah.
Case closed.
We're getting good at this, aren't we?
Oh, actually, wait. There was one thing. This is still actually at the circus, relates to the personality thing. Noah may remember me saying this when he made his big splash with I'll Say She Is and did so well with it, that I made a comment at the time to the effect of somehow that of the two contemporary Groucho impersonators, like people really playing him well, and I haven't seen Les Marsden. I've seen his Chico and his Harpo live, and I've seen Frank's Groucho live, but I haven't seen Les's Groucho live, so I can't really have an opinion. But among the better ones, I mean, I think the two best are you and Frank. And I made a comment at the time about how you seemed somehow, because of the your delivery, to be closer to the Paramount Groucho, whereas Frank was more the MGM, the good MGM Groucho, let's say, not the bad one, which you found interesting, I think, at the time. But how the hell does something like that? Because I think you have the smarter, sharper kind of tone than Frank. Frank is able to be more low key and still get away with it somehow.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think partly this comes from the fact that my Groucho is best known and most associated with I'll Say She Is, where it's a very deliberate effort to present a somewhat more embryonic version of that character. And just the nature of the aura around I'll Say She Is has to do with it being early. And then also I think because Frank's Groucho is most often seen in his Evening with Groucho, in which he presents a kind of timeless Groucho pastiche. You know, he does material from the 30s through I guess as late as the 60s even in that show. So it is more of a summary of the Groucho career, certainly from Hollywood onward.
Your template is the Shadows built Groucho, right?
Yeah, that's interesting as well as flattering. Thank you.
No, what I mean was to use the best people doing Groucho today as a kind of a tool to investigate this change in the Groucho of 3940. Yeah.
Oh, and here's another angle on that. The Groucho solo show is such a challenging proposition. Numerous people over the years have done Groucho solo shows, Frank most extensively. But the Groucho of the 20s and 30s never did that. That character alone on stage, entertaining an audience at length, is a phenomenon with no historic model. And in order to do that for an hour or two successfully, I think you probably have to, as Frank clearly has, you have to make the creative choice to make Groucho a slightly more ingratiating, crowd-pleasing, dervish of a figure, just in order to make that character work all alone on stage.
Yeah.
Well, no program about Marx mysteries would be complete without the mystery of Harpo's fluorescent radioactive hair in A Night in Casablanca. What's going on there?
Well, first of all, we should dispel the I wouldn't say rumor, but the report that it's his real hair fluffed up, because while some of it may be in the back and his sides, the fact is that he was quite bald by the time this film was shot, and whatever on top and in front has to be fake in one way or another.
I mean, the most that could be real is a little bit at the sides and back, right?
Which he would then have had to have permed.
Well, I did come across this feature article from the shooting of the film where a reporter who was on set details Harpo applying some sort of cotton candy-like fluff material to his scalp with some glue.
Yeah.
So while that basically explains what we're seeing here, it doesn't really explain why. What seems to make the most common sense is that there were reports later in the MGM days that Harpo complained about his scalp being irritated when he wore a wig all day on the hot set. So this must have been seen as a solution, for what it's worth.
So found some kind of solution that was not a real wig that made him sweat and totally blocked off all air from his scalp.
Right. It certainly couldn't be because they want it to be more real, because there's nothing else in the film about his characterization or the looks of the other brothers where they tried to do a more real look.
Right.
It's very bizarre when you compare it to the other wigs that we're used to, but once you're in the film, you get accustomed to it. It's Harpo still.
Doesn't bother me. I don't, there's the wig he wears in, I forget which one, maybe room service. There's some wigs that he wore earlier on that bother me more than his hair here in this one.
It seems so unlikely, though, that even if the issue was that the regular wig was irritating his scalp, was it more comfortable to glue stuff fluff to your head and, and have your hair dyed? They went to so much effort to, I guess if it was about making him comfortable, what was that original wig made of? Did it have sandpaper on the inside?
Too bad they didn't have CGI back then. They could have just done that.
Yeah, just give him a wig that way.
And you have to wonder what he looked like when he got home at night and took it off.
But also bear in mind here, Night in Casablanca, compared to, I think, all other films that they were in, are the ones where they had kind of the most control. It was their production more than any other. So the fact that he opted for it in this one, Paramount, MGM, RKO, these have always been studios. They've always had, probably makeup costume people who were attending to these things, and he didn't have as free a hand. And he maybe he just said, if I'm going to do it, and it's our picture this time, more than any other, really. I want to
be a platinum blonde.
That had just been his dream from day one.
As we talked about earlier, it's a shame we don't have any photos from the Night in Casablanca tour roadshow, because we'd be curious to see whether he's wearing something similar on the tour. I would assume not. I assume he did a wig when he just had to do a one show a night or 2 shows a night. Yeah.
It is so strange. It doesn't, like you, Bob, I'm not that bothered by it when I watch the movie, but it seems so strange to me that at this point in 1946, making a movie that is really a very earnest effort to recapture the old magic, and a often successful one, that they would fiddle with the basic look of one of the brothers that heavily. It's a little mind-boggling.
Well, there is one other possible explanation. And that goes back to the end of filming of the big store when they built a big bonfire and supposedly burnt all their costumes and wigs. And maybe.
Harpo was still in the very early 60s, still appearing in public with a wig and costume, and that version never reappeared after 1946.
Not least in Love Happy.
Right.
Exactly, where it was, if anything, even more his picture than any other.
Right.
So I guess we'll never know why he glued on fluff. Well, time has beaten us and we're temporarily fresh out of mysteries, but there's bound to be plenty more. Obviously, we will, when we go through the deep dives on the other films, we'll look into that. And if there are anyone listening has got any particular puzzle that we haven't mentioned, by all means, let us know, and we'll give it our best shot. But that's it for now. Thanks once again to Stewart Tryster for joining us.
Yes, thanks, Stu.
Thank you.
Thank you. Pleasure.
And thanks to you for listening, and please continue to do so. Thanks, Bob. Thanks, Noah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Time for our closing song, and as always, I don't need to tell you what it is, because it's this.
Well, you need to tell me what it is, because I'm the one who's going to edit it in.
Mrs. Wandra Klumpner, is that right?
That's right.
I'll start with you. Where's your hometown, Wanda?
My hometown is in Sommerfeld, Niederlause. It's about 5 hours from Berlin, Germany.
Wow. What is it like in Sommerfeld, in the Niederlause, in the Schnitzelbank,
Kurz und lang.
Kurz und lang, yeah?
Kurz und lang.
Kurz und lang in the Schnitzelbank. I do schönes. You know that song?
Oh, yeah.
Ist das
We
nicht
learned
ein
that in
fette
America.
Frau?
Dicke Frau.
Ja, das
dicke
ist
Sau.
ein dicker Sau. Dicke Sau, eine fette Frau, eine fette Bock, eine ganze Dock, große Eier, Judenmeier, schönes Ding, eine goldene Ring, krummen Kragen, Wagen, Rad, hinten eine Hände, große Kutschenlang, Schnitzelbank. I do schöne, I do schöne, I do schöne Schnitzelbank.